It is certainly good to be here this afternoon. And given the introduction, I was thinking on the way up here, so in the last few years, as you heard, I've been blessed to be doing some traveling with my students. And I thought, you know, I've stood on Mount Sinai, I've stood on the Temple Mount, I've stood on Mars Hill in Athens, and been in the catacombs just outside of Rome. But you know what? This is as exciting as all those for me. I mean, it is as historical and certainly a significant presence in our history, who we are as a people, and it is a privilege to have this opportunity to be with you all this afternoon. So it is right and good to be in this place. Now, I'm going to confess something. There are a couple dangers that come with history professor. Well, there's more than a couple of dangers that come with history professor. But two of the most dangerous. One, we get lost in giving you all the context and we never get to the subject. And the second one is, especially someone like me, can get a little enthusiastic and go, well, we just don't know how to restrain ourselves sometimes. So I have a manuscript that I'm going to try to hold myself to. Maybe it will keep me on topic and directed. And I hope there's plenty of time for conversation and questions after. So again, it is right and good to be in this place this afternoon to honor the revivals that shaped the course of history. As you all know, in 1800, Logan County, Kentucky was one stage, an important stage, on which to play out an age-old question of human experience across time and across cultures, across millennia and continents. An enduring question has been, is religion an opiate, a sedative that dulls people into accepting their state in life, suppressing their frustrations and yielding to the powers that be? Or is religion a stimulant, a force that energizes, spurring people to transformation and change? Well, a historically informed answer to this enduring either-or question might be yes. So allow me to unpack that just a little bit. On the one hand, there's this claim that religion dulls people, gets them to settle into their state in life. And some have, in fact, asserted that religion deadens, it numbs, it anesthetizes people to the injustices that affect them, their neighbors, and their world. Life, in other words, is not as it should be. Oppression and injustice might reign unchecked, which people ought to contest, but thanks to religion perhaps, or at least as this theory goes, people endure the pain so long as they keep their eyes on heaven. One may be ridiculed or impoverished, abused, mistreated, marginalized now, but the theory goes, at some point we fly away to heaven where everything will just be okay. Life on this earth may be unfair and limiting, but in heaven one will be whole. So in this case, religion is something of an analgesic. Because of this palliative, one need not contest unjust social problems, political despots, or repressive economic systems, etc. Reviewing the course of history, institutionalized religion from time to time seems to have indeed propped up the privileged and their principalities and their powers at the expense of the common person. Perhaps a couple illustrations would help illustrate. First, consider the moment in the 4th century when Constantine turned and outlawed socially provocative faith into a moderate, empire-affirming movement. For 300 years, Christianity had run counter to the imperial culture, but with the Constantinian shift, as it's sometimes referred to, faith began to baptize the empire's acquisitive and expansionistic agenda. Or second, consider the social and political claims of Boniface VIII, who in the 14th century proclaimed that he was the final word, the absolute authority on all matters, political and ecclesiastical, thereby providing foundation for some of medieval Christianity's greatest tyrannies and transgressions. We could also include, perhaps, the example of Jonathan Boucher. I don't know if that name's familiar. He's an American loyalist preacher who invoked that age-old doctrine of the divine right of kings. And in doing so, he was calling his fellow Americans to remain subservient to the British crown. In each of these cases, religion reinforced the status quo, pacifying potential dissent. That's one side, that's one theory. But of course, we also know that history is more complex than that. And as the 20th century American theologian Howard Thurman noted, early Christianity as a movement was of, for, and by people whose backs were against the wall. Early generations of Christians were all too familiar with exploitation and occupation by a powerful empire. They had experienced firsthand how the privileged would subjugate the vulnerable. Indeed, critics of Christianity, like the 2nd century philosopher Celsus, dismissed Christianity as only good for people on the margins, enslaved, the uneducated. And in this narration, rather than passive acceptance, the Christian story becomes one of transformative social witness. Here was a movement resisting on this earth at this time, living out a profound, scandalous equity that was depicted, described, for example, in Galatians 3:28. In Christ there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free. There's no longer male or female, for you are all one. And I could give some examples here, but I think what's most relevant for our conversation and reflection today, I would invite you to consider the wealth of reform movements birthed by the Second Great Awakening at the dawn of the 19th century. The list of reform initiatives emerging out of that Second Great Awakening includes prison reform, women's rights, temperance, just to name three. We know from Richard McNamara, an eyewitness, reportedly here in 1800 and at Cane Ridge in 1801, how these revivals incited non-traditional practices counter to the cultural convention at the time. Quote, no sex, nor color, class, or description were exempted from the pervading influence of the Spirit, McNamara reported. All creeds, confessions, forms of worship, rules of government ought to be laid aside. No distinction as to age, sex, color, or anything of temporary nature. Old and young, male and female, black and white, had equal privilege to minister to the light which they had received in whatever way the Spirit directed. So it was these frontier camp revivals. They were arguably the most egalitarian expression that the nation was witnessing at that time. And the revival here at Red River helped instigate this cultural awakening. So for several good reasons, we must continue telling the story of what occurred at Red River 225 years ago, because Red River shaped the course of religious history in the United States. Because Red River influenced U.S. social policy from that day forward, and because Red River illuminates one of the great questions of human experience. When is religion an opiate, and when is it a stimulant? Now, I do not claim that all or even most of those individuals who attended the revivals here in 1800 went on to engage in social reform movements. It's unlikely that we could find information to substantiate such an assertion. We can, however, espouse that what started here and what was copied throughout the region and across the young nation gave impetus to what William McLaughlin once called, quote, a religious revitalization of American culture. It was the Second Great Awakening, noted for its supercharged spirit, its enthusiastic ethos, its outrageous optimism, that common folks, those with no institutional endorsement and perhaps even fewer economic and political resources, they set out to right the wrongs of society. These folks would not wait until the institutional agencies got around to effecting the long-delayed change. These, the religiously awakened, acted for the good of their neighbors and for the nation. And the wealth of historical evidence to illustrate and substantiate the stimulus that religion provided to social transformation, I would argue, is quite immense. Several books have chronicled the reformist zeal of the Second Great Awakening. But again, for our purposes today, let's focus for a moment on the abolitionist movement. And let's start here. Who in antebellum America had the least amount of social and political capital? A plausible case, I think, could be made for women of color. In a society that often paid close attention to race and gender, black women existed on the most extreme of margins. So how is it that Maria W. Stewart found the calling to become the first woman of color to publicly call for the immediate, uncompensated abolition of slavery? The answer? She was a child of the Second Great Awakening. Although born free in a free state, Connecticut, due to her race, Maria Stewart was denied access to formal education. Nevertheless, like her contemporary Frederick Douglass, once she learned to read, her mind, she said, was forever free. She tapped into the great cardinal virtue of courage to become a champion of abolition. How long, she asked, will the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and their talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles? Whether formally educated or not, by virtue of one's God-given moral compass, everybody knew that slavery was wrong. The institutional religion of that, like Richard Furman in South Carolina, might cloak America's original sin in hermeneutic doublespeak, but everyone's God-formed conscience told them better. So like many, Stewart was tempted, she confessed, quote, to retain the world in one hand and religion in the other, which would have allowed her to isolate or to quarantine social and political realities apart from her faith. Had this been the case, her religion might have been that opium that I alluded to earlier. But for her, the biblical teaching of ye cannot serve God and mammon proved far more compelling. Consequently, she converted during the Second Great Awakening, and hers was not a conversion of faith, longing for streets of gold up yonder by and by. Rather, as a direct result, an extension of her newfound faith, her soul was, quote, fired with a holy zeal for your cause, she told an abolitionist meeting. Every nerve, every muscle in me was engaged for chattel slavery's immediate eradication. I felt that now I had a great work to perform and was in haste to make a profession of my faith in Christ so that I might be about my Father's abolitionist business. For freedom is, she said, God's cause, here and now. Though men and devils may oppose it, she concluded, abolition is the word of God, she continued. So after her conversion, the Spirit of God came upon me, she explained, and I spake before many. I tell you the truth, I believe that God has fired my soul with holy zeal for this cause. It was God alone who inspired my heart to publish the abolitionist meditations hereof. Hence she aligned herself with William Lloyd Garrison, and his band of the American Anti-Slavery Society and their abolitionists movement and their abolitionist cause. Redeemed by God, she said, she could not, she would not tolerate an unregenerate society. She was ordained, entrusted with the mission to articulate the injustice of slavery and to expose the living hell of the enslaved. In her abolitionist stump speeches, Stewart's forthright altar call summoned all God's faithful to come forward, join the crusade to end the ongoing nightmare of slavery. As elsewhere in the Second Great Awakening, one's race or gender was not an excuse. Black or white, male or female, when the Holy Spirit called, none dare refuse. With God on the side of freedom, God's people better show up and get on the work to reparative justice. Too many think, Stewart asserted, that because your skins are tinged with sable hue, that you are an inferior race of beings. But God does not consider you as such. And according to the Constitution of these United States, God has made all of us free and equal. Stewart's political theology was indeed like that of her colleague, William Lloyd Garrison, in that conversion was more than an exclusively individual event. As we see in Garrison, Stewart, and many other abolitionists, one's eternal salvation was interwoven with the salvation of society. Let me say that one again. One's eternal salvation was interwoven with the salvation of society. Garrison's understanding of his own destiny, historian James Brewer Stewart noted, became more powerfully attached to that of an oppressed, despised people. Garrison, born and raised in Newburyport, Massachusetts, had no first-hand experience of slavery. Nonetheless, his faith had a decidedly this world and public-spirited dimension. For him, like so many of the Second Great Awakening, a faithful conversion required more than a personal relationship with the divine. It required identification, a casting one's lot with the alienated, and in this case, the enslaved, living out God's commitment to the so-called least of these. Emancipation, therefore, promised the redemption of all humanity, the moral revolution that would open a purer phase of history where God's will would prevail on earth as it is in heaven. We find another example of this abolitionist revival fervor in the lives of the sisters Sarah and Angelina Grimke. Now, like Saul of Tarsus from the biblical book of Acts, these sisters seemed the least likely candidates for the historic role they were about to play. But such transformation and recommissioning proved part and parcel of the Second Great Awakening. Sarah and Angelina, for instance, were born into privilege as daughters of a wealthy slaveholding plantation family near Charleston, South Carolina. Had they lived a quiet life, accepting the status quo, asking few questions, making few waves, they could have enjoyed all the blessings of an antebellum American dream. Their faith might have secured a social apathy. Sarah, the eldest, however, loved to read. And in her books, she encountered troubling questions. For example, why is the world not the way it's supposed to be? Why do inequities exist in our world? Well, as a mentor to her sister, some 13 years her younger, Sarah infected Angelina with such questions and dilemmas. Together, they found the institutional religion of their youth moribund, and each in her turn experienced a religious conversion during the Second Great Awakening. For Sarah Grimke, faithful discipleship required that Christians recognize and honor the image of God in every human being, thus practicing a faith-inspired egalitarianism. quote, according to historian Goode Lerner, Sarah had read John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, other Enlightenment thinkers, so that her writing consistently integrated these political ideals with biblical analysis. She's fusing the reading of these founding figures with her understanding of the biblical text. For Sarah, therefore, the Declaration's profession that all are created equally and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights became religious dogma. After her conversion, Angelina, her abolitionist role proved more public. Her inaugural step onto the civic stage came with her appeal to Christian women of the South, a momentous step and a dangerous step, to be sure. In essence, Angelina asked her fellow Southern women to do 4 things. Now imagine the context. You're from one of the richest, most powerful families, slave-holding families in South Carolina, and you are now stepping out on the stage as an abolitionist. And she says, all right, here are 4 things that I am asking women to do. First, undertake a deep dive into the biblical text, inasmuch as the Bible is an abolitionist primer, she said. Even the enemies of abolitionists, she scoffed, acknowledged that abolitionist doctrines are drawn from the Bible. When she described the 1835 anti-slavery riot in Boston, for instance, Angelina told a story where rioters were throwing books and pamphlets of the American Anti-Slavery Society out the office windows. But in the chaos, she describes, one of the individuals laid hold of the Bible and was about tossing it out to the ground, when another reminded him that it was the Bible in his hand and he shouldn't throw it out the window and onto the ground. His response was, "Oh, 'tis all but one." And so out went the sacred volume along with the rest. And Angelina acknowledged, yes, he was right, because it is all one. For our books and papers are mostly commentaries on the Bible and the Declaration of Independence. So number 1, a deep dive into the biblical text. 2, Angelina counseled, women should pray. Pray for the enslaved, pray for the enslaver. Pray for all your brethren and sisters who are laboring in this righteous cause of emancipation in the northern states, in England, and in the world. 3rd, speak up. Advocate abolition to relatives, to friends, acquaintances, but especially to your husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons, that slavery is a crime against God and man, and that it is a sin to keep human beings. And 4th, act, and as necessary, act up. Nonviolent civil disobedience is, she proclaimed, a celebrated witness throughout the Bible. I know that this doctrine of obeying God rather than man will be considered dangerous and heretical by many. She acknowledged that, but I'm not afraid openly to avow, because it is the doctrine of the Bible. Angelina Grimke knew that her faith-inspired appeal was inflammatory, if not totally reckless. But invoking the tradition of Esther from the Hebrew Bible, she conceded, if I perish, I perish. And she was not far off. When copies of her speech reached the Grimke sisters' hometown of Charleston in South Carolina, the copies were publicly burned by the postmaster. And for her faith-informed activism, Angelina was exiled from her home state of South Carolina, and she lost her birthright privileges. Because of her faith, she had to build a new life as something of an alien in New England. More on that in a moment. But I want to take a little discursus here, because I think this is really important and helps us understand our context here today. Let me call attention to one other notable element from Angelina Grimke's appeal, for she referenced in her appeal a political theology that inspired many during the Second Great Awakening. Why must Christians, as Christians, abolish chattel slavery? Because, she explained, quote, slavery must be overthrown before the biblical prophecies can be accomplished. Biblical prophecies. There's an important dimension. She continues, will the wheels of the millennial car roll onward by miraculous power? No, she asserted. God confers this holy privilege on humans. It is through our instrumentality that the great and glorious work of the reforming of this world is to be done. So she's saying, don't sit back and wait God to fix it. Y'all step up. It's time for us to make it right. So here is America's politically and socially amped up, sorry for the cumbersome term, but it's called a post-millennial theology. The positive outcome of all human history. Think about that. The positive outcome of all human history is riding on human efforts. Now, the Second Great Awakening did not give birth to this post-millennial theology. You will find antecedents of it in the First Great Awakening. But essentially, postmillennialism operates from the optimistic view that both history and human potential, God's army of the redeemed, could, through human genius and faithful effort, bend the course of history toward the good, even toward the perfect. That's exceptional. In other words, if American disciples harnessed their power, eradicating the nation's grave human failings, such as chattel slavery, then the United States would grow in holiness and sanctification. And this is not a personal, individual, or an otherworldly salvation. This enthusiastic postmillennialism, as historian Ernest Lee Tuvison declared, held the promise that the United States could lead in the redemption of the world and the coming of God's kingdom in its fullness on earth.
Jesus. Yes.
That's an amazing proclamation that they are articulating, motivated by. A religiously awakened U.S. could be the world's benevolent empire. The question posed by Christian abolitionists like Angelina Grimke was whether the nation would accept God's Great Commission. Now at this point, let me mention just one more religiously motivated abolitionist. Theodore Dwight Weld may or may not be a name you've heard. He was converted by Charles Grandison Finney, another big name from the Second Great Awakening, one of the notable preachers. And he converted the young Weld, setting the latter, Weld, on a path toward an abolitionist cause. To pursue his calling, Weld discerned that he needed further education, and made possible by a generous scholarship from the wealthy abolitionist brothers Arthur and Lewis Tappan, who had made a killing in the silk industry and decided to use their funds to help create this new benevolent America. He had this scholarship. He enrolled in the Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. But he could not wait until graduation to begin his abolitionist work. Lane students, stirred by Weld, started community building with local African Americans, generally flouting social convention and protocols, even in a free state such as Ohio. Moreover, Weld coordinated an intensive 18-day public debate on faith-based abolition, which drew considerable attention, the kind of attention that colleges and universities might not always desire. Thus, the Lane Board of Trustees, facing mounting pressure to squelch such student activism, banned the students from abolitionist activities. Weld, inciting America's, perhaps, it's hard to distinguish which one might have come first, a student-led rebellion, led some 50 students from Lane to Charles Grandison Finney's Oberlin College, thereby earning the nickname the Lane Rebels. Now, beyond his academic exploits at Lane and Oberlin, Weld joined, here we are again seeing William Lloyd Garrison, the American Anti-Slavery Society, and there he also found his soulmate, Angelina Grimke.
Wow.
And the two of them married, becoming America's faith-based abolitionist power couple of the moment. And together they authored an all-important expose titled American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. It was this volume which collected documents that was often referenced by Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe in their respective works. Weld's point was direct and consistent, as with Maria Stewart and Angelina Grimke. Who is culpable for slavery? Weld asked. Our government stands first chargeable for allowing slavery to exist under its jurisdiction. But second, the fault lies with the states for enacting laws to secure the victim. But at the end of the day, the slaveholder is to blame for carrying out such enactments in horrid form enough to chill the blood. Every person who knows what slavery is, he said, and does not raise his voice against this crime sin, by silence gives consent to its continuance, is chargeable with guilt in the sight of God. The blood of Zacharias, who was slain between the temple and the altar, says Christ, will I require of this generation. That's pretty bold preaching. Eventually, Weld and Grimke became frustrated with William Lloyd Garrison's political views, and inasmuch as Garrison thought the U.S. Constitution, again, this is Garrison, not Weld, Garrison thought the Constitution gave the game over to the pro-slavery forces. So Garrison would dismiss the Constitution as, quote, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Pretty bold language. Weld said, hold on, that can't be entirely accurate. And here he drew upon the example of William Wilberforce in England, who used his position as a member of Parliament to abolish slavery in England. Thus, Weld and Grimke moved to Washington, D.C. to work with former President John Quincy Adams in the formation and the advancement of an abolitionist political party, the Liberty Party, a forerunner to what will become the Free Soil and the Republican Party. What started in a small religious revival for Weld led to action at the center of U.S. power. Now, as I conclude, it would be easy to continue regaling you. Here's the problem with historians, so I'm trying to not do this. Biographies of second-grade awakeners so vital to the abolitionist movement. So I'm now going to sneak one or two in. As a child of the Stone Campbell movement, I could talk of Barton W. Stone, the one converted directly by the preaching of James McGready, and one who intently studied the revivals here at Red River to replicate them at Cane Ridge. Stone's second-grade awakening faith ignited his abolitionist fervor. And that faith-inspired individuals comprised many, and likely most of the abolitionist movement. It seems pretty obvious in the historical documents. Faith prompted Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, David Walker, John Brown, Eliza P. Lovejoy, and so many more in the work they shouldered to eradicate chattel slavery in the U.S. And I focused on three who were converted during the Second Great Awakening to illustrate that what happened truly here 225 years ago changed not only Logan County, changed not only the Commonwealth of Kentucky, changed not only the United States of America, but changed the world that came after. From this place, on these acres, came a profound change in the course of human history. These three, Stewart, Grimke, Weld, claim to be spiritual descendants of those socially awakened Christians of some 1800 years before. In like manner, may the awakened soul of Red River motivate those committed to our moment in our time. This was the living legacy of Logan County, Kentucky then. May it also be so now. Thank you.